The next book that we're going to be talking about is called Moment of Truth, How to Think About Alberta's Future, and it's written by Jack Mintz and Ted Morton. And contributing a chapter to that book is Preston Manning. So Preston, thanks for your time today.
Well, thank you, Colin.
And so, Preston, you know, I think everyone knows your background. You've been around in politics for a long time now. Your dad was the Premier of Alberta many, many years ago. And then, of course, you were active in politics during the National Energy Program under Pierre Trudeau. And then, obviously, you founded the Reform Party. But thinking back to everything that you've seen in Alberta over the years, the frustration's very high in Alberta right now. Has it ever been this high before?
Well, Colin, I think the only time it was higher was probably during the Depression. Alberta's net income dropped by over 60%. Agriculture was 90% of the economy, and that economy collapsed both because of low prices and a combination of drought. The bankruptcies were not only in the private sector, but you had municipalities went bankrupt. Alberta had to default on the interest payments on its debt, so it couldn't borrow. And there was violence in the coal mines in the Crow's Nest area, violence when the R.B. Bennett tried to stop the march on Ottawa at Regina. But I think the lesson out of that frustration that's relevant to really the point you want to make is that frustration forced a whole bunch of rethinking on the economy, on the social side, on the institutions. It led to the creation of the Canadian Wheat Board, the Bank of Canada, two major political parties that came out of the West. So I think the lesson for us is how can we channel this frustration, which is at a high level, how can we channel that frustration into some constructive change? And that's basically what this book on Moment of Truth is trying to address.
And so in your chapter, you talk about the terms little Westerners and big Westerners. Could you tell us about those two terms that you've used and how that relates to...
Well, yeah, that's a great Western story. It comes out of a debate that was held in 1901 between F.W.G. Haltane, who was the last great premier of the Northwest when it was one big political community, and he had a debate with Rodman Roblin, who was the premier of the Manitoba when it was the little postage stamp province. And what they were debating was, should the West allow the West to be divided up into smaller units, as the Laurier government proposed, to divide it into 3 provinces and 2 territories. And Rodman argued that they should do that, partly because he wanted to be premier of one of those units. But Haltane argued that the West should stay as one big unit, the Northwest, to counterbalance the size and the weight of Ontario and Quebec. And he labeled the people that wanted to let the West be divided up, he would include the sovereigntists today, into a smaller unit as little Westerners. And he argued that the people that wanted to keep it as one big unit to exert its clout as big Westerners. And he won the debate that night in Indian Head. But unfortunately, the West lost the bigger debate when Laurier divided the West into 5 different units.
And yet here we are many, many decades later, and yet we still have this deep-seated frustration in Western Canada about the relationship between the West and the rest of the country. There's obviously a lot of discussion right now between some people who say, okay, they're fed up, they want Alberta to separate, and other people are saying, you know what, we just got to keep tinkering and maybe try and negotiate a new deal within Confederation. What's your thought? Which approach do you think we need and why?
Well, I think the best immediate response, Colin, and basically this book provides a lot of ammunition for that, is to clarify the options. And what this means to people that want to talk about secession is there's a lot of questions in that they have to answer. Have they studied the previous secession attempts in Canada, all of which failed, so that if the West tries, it doesn't make the same mistakes? Where's the constitution for the new country? You won't persuade common sense Westerners to join some new country unless they can see what the Constitution is and what's the form of government. Where's the cost-benefit analysis, the real one, that shows the West would be better off economically as an independent country rather than as a province? Where's the strategy for getting pipelines to Tidewater if you're an independent nation versus within the Federation? There's a whole bunch of questions, I think, that have to be clarified if people that advocate secession want that to be taken as a serious option. And then on the other side, I wouldn't say what's needed is tinkering with the current Federation. What are the major proposals for change that have to be advocated to get a fair deal for the West? And that needs to be fleshed out. What do you have to do to get a domestic free trade agreement, for example, which would benefit us? What do you have to do to get access to the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Arctic through unobstructed transportation corridors? What constitutional amendments would you have that would address unfairness to the West? All of that has to be fleshed out. And I say to people when they say, well, what can you do under these circumstances? I say, let's clarify the options, and then we can have a discussion, maybe even a referendum on which is the best one to pursue. And it's really, secession is one option, status quo is another, which I think is unacceptable, but major changes that virtually involve reconfederation is a third option.
And so, you know, if you think about Canada, it's no secret that Quebec has a lot of clout. A lot of politicians kind of walk on eggshells around Quebec when issues come up. But yet at the same time, Quebec, they don't just have a large population that I think gets them the respect that they want in Ottawa, but they also have a separatist party. What do you say to those who think that we need to have a separatist party in Alberta and just elect a few people to show that Alberta is really serious and start to turn some heads so that Canadians understand the frustration that's going on in this country, or in this part of the country?
I think that forming a separatist party and electing separatist members to Ottawa would delight the federal Liberals. And in fact, there's this talk under the radar screen in Ottawa already, because what they see that party doing is splitting the Conservative Party vote in the West, and therefore opening the door to a Liberal majority government. So I understand the frustration that produces that. I think that's going to be that would be one of the practical political consequences. The other thing for Westerners to be careful about is to not exaggerate Quebec's importance, particularly going forward in the 21st century. The whole economic shift in North America, the demographic shift, is towards the Asia Pacific. Time is on our side. I have a graph in this book, the recent book that I did, that shows the number of French speakers in relation to English speakers going down. Shows the Quebec population in relation to the total population going down. Quebec GDP in relation to total GDP going down. And what I've said to my Quebec friends is what that's going to mean for you. It's either going to be a revival of separatism in Quebec, or the Quebec Federalists are going to have to find allies in some other part of the country. And the thing I say to them, one place you could find them is in Western Canada. Both of us want a more decentralized federation. You for social and cultural linguistic reasons, us for economic reasons. So I think there's a way of turning some of Quebec's interests into our benefit, but it involves alliance and coalition building rather than growing further apart.
So if I read between the lines here and someone gets a very serious Western separation party going and they ask you to lead it, are you saying that you're not going to enter politics again and lead a separatist party?
No, I've tried this once before, but I would be on the side of pushing for this reconfederation. I understand the frustration that's causing this. It was the same thing in the 1980s and 1990s when reform was started. In fact, it was broader then than it is now, because it included Manitoba, had been alienated by the CF18 decision. British Columbia, reform got more seats in British Columbia than it did in Alberta, got all the seats except one on Vancouver Island. It was broader in that time, and the options were, do you just pursue separation, or do you pursue trying to increase the West clout within Federation? We went the second route, and Westerners endorsed it.
And so, Preston, I know you're a great storyteller, and you were involved recently with a provincial committee here in Alberta that was looking at sort of a I'll say a new deal. Were there any particular stories that stood out in your mind as you talked to Albertans about the frustration that they're seeing and what's happening with Alberta's place in Confederation?
Well, this maybe isn't a story exactly, Colin, but one of the things that does come up is what kind of constitutional changes would fundamentally improve the West position? Often that gets onto Senate reform, which is the hardest one to get. So before the last federal election, I wrote around to some of my constitutional lawyer friends and said, look, there's already 7 conservative-oriented provincial governments, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and New Brunswick and PEI, although those were minority governments at the time, and the CAQ bunch in Quebec are more conservative than anything else. If you had a conservative government in Ottawa, you now have the ingredients for a fundamental constitutional change, because to change our constitution, as you know, you need 7 provinces plus the federal government in order to do that. So I asked our constitutional friends, what single constitutional change would actually improve the West position? And the best one that came out of that was a suggestion to get a constitutional amendment prohibiting federal government spending, taxing, treaty making, legislating in areas of provincial jurisdiction, such as natural resources, or joint jurisdiction, such as health and the environment, unless the federal government can get the approval of the province that's affected. That one constitutional change would probably do more to help the West position, give the West an option to opt out of the whole bunch of federal things if they don't agree with it, than any other constitutional change. And while the fair deal meetings, people raise some kind of constitutional change, often it focused on Senate reform, which I'm still very much in favor of. I think working for this other constitutional change would be the best single constitutional change the West could get.
And I think that's a good example of a macro change. Are there any others, policy changes or even sort of relationship type changes that you would recommend to, say, a leader like Erin O'Toole, who I think would be more sensitive to the needs of Western Canada, given the large number of seats that his party holds? What advice would you give to him aside from the issue that we just talked about?
I would say some of these things that the West is demanding are actually beneficial to other parts of the country. This business of domestic free trade. We have these internal barriers to trade that hurt everybody. They hurt Ontario as much as they hurt the West. So can we not get a domestic free trade agreement? And a big province like Ontario being supportive of that would be enormously helpful. The West has pursued that for years. This constitutional amendment, it would require the support of other provincial governments, not just the provincial ones. So is that not something people can agree on? And one of the things I point out to us Westerners, and the sovereignist crowd particularly, we tend to talk about Eastern Canada and Central Canada as one big homogeneous unit, and they're all against everything we want. Anybody that's campaigned for votes in those other regions, as I have, hundreds of meetings, knows that many of our Western things can resonate with them. Northwestern Ontario is as alienated from Toronto as we are. It's a resource development region, and it's got denied access to a whole bunch of things. There's a chunk of Quebec that is like that. Newfoundland has got much in common with us. The biggest trade barrier in the country is Quebec's unwillingness to wheel Newfoundland power across Quebec to the New York market. So one of the things I would stress is that there's some commonality in other parts of the country with some of the West concerns, and coalition building, as distinct from isolation, is probably a better way to go.
And so obviously I think you'd find a more receptive ear to Erin O'Toole, but let's imagine for a second a hypothetical scenario where the Prime Minister calls you up and he's looking for something that might be doable for him in his view of how Canada should be. What would be your advice as maybe a policy change or something he could do to try to temper frustration in Western Canada?
Well, if it was the current prime minister, and it's highly unlikely that he would give me a call, because I would say, I think you're the most foolish, incompetent, and unethical prime minister we've had. But the federal government, of course, could, if the federal government was supportive of some of these types of measures, it could do a lot. This constitutional amendment, for example, needs the support of the Parliament of Canada. This domestic free trade. Our Constitution says trade and commerce is a federal responsibility. The federal government has the power to knock down internal barriers to trade. It doesn't exercise it because of the political problem with Quebec. So I would endeavor to get a sympathetic prime minister to address some of these things that would address the West's concern. And I would point out that if you don't, you're going to have a national unity problem in the West, like you have with Quebec, but it's got an economic rationale behind it that Quebec doesn't have.
Okay, so I've made a note here that you and the Prime Minister are not exactly golfing buddies. I'm going to, as a final question for you, Preston, you wrote a book called Do Something. What is your advice to everyday people who are watching this discussion? People who, they're not at the top levels of politics, they're everyday people, maybe they're working for a car dealership or the dental hygienist, whatever. What can they do to try to advance these ideas? That's a very
good question, Colin, and a good question to end on. For one thing, I say participate in developing and joining these coalitions to push some of these big ideas. There's a coalition forming called C2C2C that's working to get these transportation corridors to the Atlantic and the Pacific and the Arctic. Join one of these. Okay. Ask your MP and your MLA, what is their position on these major things that would improve the West's position? What is the position of their party? Are they for it or are they against it? And thirdly, demand referendum on these subjects. I know some people want a referendum on secession. I want to see a referendum where millions of people would say, we want a domestic free trade agreement. We want unobstructed corridors to the Atlantic and Pacific, where millions of people say that you want to create pressure on the federal government. If 48% of the landmass of the country, which is the big Western area with 10 million people, start demanding some of the things, that's a lot more than just one province. And lastly, I'd say if you get these referendum proposals, participate in those referendum campaigns. And my point in that Do Something book is I do worry, particularly with you've heard me ad nauseum on this, with the advent of social media, that we tend to substitute discussion on these things for actually doing something. We talk about it, we conference about it, we write about it, we blog about it, we tweet about it, but what do you do? And I'm saying join these coalitions, demand referendum, insist on answers from your political parties, and participate in a referendum campaign that will demonstrate the amount of public support there are for some of these fundamental changes.
All right. Well, I think you've certainly given viewers a lot to think about. You've provided some good constructive ideas on things that they can do. Thanks for your time today, Preston. And if people are interested in more information on this book, whereabouts can they find it?
Well, I think it's the same. It's on Amazon and the usual places. If I was in a public meeting, I would be waving this book around. But I think that's the way to get it. Basically, you can order it online, and some of the bookstores, but ordering it online is probably the fastest and the quickest way.
All right. Well, perfect. Thanks again for your time today, Preston.